Hollywood, a place of the imagination, of invention and reinvention, a place that hardly exists. Things made here are mirages, illusions. The underlying fabric is unwoven, neutral, a blank slate. Only shadows take form. Everything else is up for grabs. Make of it what you will, what you dream. Igor Stravinsky was a man of order. He could find it anywhere. Jean Cocteau said, "As soon as you begin talking to this man, everything is numbers, and disorder ceases." Hollywood is chaos, particles of dust blown by the desert winds. For an artist like Stravinsky, Hollywood was both a disappointment and a challenge. Without forces to constrain his imagination, he found himself free to consider all possibilities. But without some underlying order, he was lost. Eventually, he reached a crisis, a failure to find the order that had guided him in the past. Perhaps he sensed that his old ways of creating were failing. New modes would be needed. He looked within himself and without. He looked in the desert. He looked into the abyss. In 1938, Igor Stravinsky was considered by many to be the greatest living composer. It was a reputation he had won in Paris one night in 1913, when the scandal of the Sacre had brought him instant notoriety, capping a successful trilogy of ballets for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. In the years just before this, Stravinsky had enjoyed a period of relative calm and creative prosperity. One might say that the whole world had. But now things were starting to close in on him. Stravinsky was not Jewish, but his music was being swept up with the other composers of so-called degenerate music, and performances were becoming few and far between. Added to that, his family was falling apart through sickness and death. Within the space of just 6 months in 1939, Igor Stravinsky lost his aging mother, and his wife and eldest daughter both died to tuberculosis, a disease he himself had struggled with since birth. An ocean away, Walt Disney was making a full-length animated film in which he would create a new style of motion picture presentation, one in which music would be given a new prominence. In fact, the animations would be made to the music, and not the other way around. When Stravinsky's infamous Sacre du Printemps was suggested as accompaniment to scenes of prehistoric life, Disney jumped at the idea. Stravinsky, who had visited Hollywood once before, saw his future mapped out in front of him. Perhaps this would present the opportunity for him to become once again the center of gravity for a new art form, another Paris maybe, this time for an even bigger audience, bigger fame, bigger fortune. But Disney held the upper hand. The Rite of Spring, being Russian, was not covered by copyright in the United States, and Disney could use the music as he chose without permission. In the end, he offered $6,000 to keep things above board and to use Stravinsky's name. So, with war in the air and personal crisis assailing him from every side, Stravinsky took a bold step into his future. On the 22nd of September 1939, he boarded the SS Manhattan, bound for New York and America. It was just 3 weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Stravinsky was 57 years old in 1939, and he had been carrying on a more or less open relationship with his mistress, Vera de Bosse-Sudeikina, for some 20 years. When his wife died, he was free to pursue it in a more direct way. Vera arrived in the United States in the early spring of 1940. They quickly headed out to Hollywood together to check up on progress with his film, now entitled Fantasia. What he saw and heard shocked him. His score had been severely truncated and rearranged, and he found the animations to be silly concoctions. But Stravinsky was powerless to complain. Yet for all his dissatisfactions, the use of his music in Fantasia went a long way towards bringing his name to a large and largely new audience. That the music was his most striking and controversial score didn't hurt either, even if it was already more than 25 years old. With Fantasia under his belt, $6,000 richer, and without having had to write a note of music, Stravinsky might well have thought that his prospects in Hollywood were rosy indeed. But there were certain realities of the Hollywood studio system that he would yet have to learn. Stravinsky and Vera settled into this house in Hollywood, high above Sunset Strip on Weatherly Drive. It was to remain their home for the next almost 30 years. They were married in this small Russian Orthodox church nearby. Stravinsky lived in Hollywood longer than in any other one place. He lived there in the first house he ever owned, and his years there saw the emergence of his late-period works, an artistic rebirth rare in any artist and almost unheard of in one in his 60s. Hollywood was a culturally rich town in 1939, and the Stravinskys soon found themselves surrounded by movie stars and literati of all stripes. Author Franz Werfel was typical of the expat community. An Austrian Jew, Werfel had fled after the Anschluss and settled in Hollywood. En route, he had stopped in Lourdes and been struck by the story of the young girl Bernadette Soubirous, who claimed to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary in a cave in the town. Werfel ended up writing a book about her, Song of Bernadette, which became a big bestseller when it was published in 1941. 20th Century Fox quickly decided to make it into a movie. The studio turned to Stravinsky, who seemed the perfect composer for such a prestige project. But as with many dreams dreamt in Hollywood, this one didn't pan out. Stravinsky wrote some music, but it was never used. For Stravinsky, the composer was king, and he would not permit so much as a single note to be altered in his scores. This was an untenable state of affairs within a studio system that considered even writers to be easily expendable. Composers ranked far lower still. In the end, Stravinsky recycled music he had conceived for the apparition of the Virgin scene as the middle movement of his symphony in 3 movements, a work now considered to be his first large-scale American work. Today, placing this music into the scene for which it was composed, although it is doubtful Stravinsky ever would have seen this before composing it, we can get an idea of how it might have worked and how it might not have. Stravinsky was also involved in several other movie projects, although none of them came to any better resolution than Bernadette. Jane Eyre, with screenplay by Stravinsky's friend Aldous Huxley, and starring Orson Welles, was another prestige project for which Stravinsky might have seemed perfectly suited. Stravinsky immersed himself in the world of Bronte and composed several cues, but again his music was not used. Here's the scene where Jane first encounters Rochester, synced with Stravinsky's Ode, which he recycled from his work for this film.
Can I do anything?
Stand out of the way.
I'm sorry I frightened your horse.
Apologies won't mend my ankle. Down, violence! Well, what are you waiting for?
I can't leave until I see you're fit to ride.
A will of your own. Where from?
From Mr. Rochester's house just below.
You know Mr. Rochester?
No, I've never seen him.
You're not a servant at the hall.
I'm the new governess.
Oh. The new governess.
With America now firmly committed to the wars in Europe and Japan, there were any number of propagandistic films being made by the studios. Stravinsky was approached to compose for two of them, North Star and Commandos Strike at Dawn. In both cases, Stravinsky composed some music, and in both cases his work was not used. His music for Commandos became his 4 Norwegian moods.
Now you can turn around.
Your wedding cake. Oh, how beautiful. Oh, thank you.
Make a wish.
I will.
Despite these failures, Stravinsky liked living in Southern California. Always proud of his trim physique, he loved the sun and the easy lifestyle. His daily regimen included morning headstands. He kept to his strict compositional schedule, serious composing in the mornings, orchestration and copying in the evenings. He played solitaire, tended to roses in his garden, and hobnobbed with his literate neighbors, with all but one, that is. Another major musical figure who lived in Los Angeles at the time was Arnold Schoenberg. One might say that he was Stravinsky's rival, the only other composer on his level. Already, followers camped on one side or the other. Schoenberg the progressive, Stravinsky the reactionary. But through all his early years in Los Angeles, Stravinsky ignored Schoenberg, and Schoenberg returned the favor. There was respect, no doubt, and admiration, but there was no meeting, of the minds or otherwise. In 1945, they came as close as they ever would in Hollywood. The film composer Nathaniel Shilkret came up with the concept of portraying the first book of the Bible in purely musical terms, inspired perhaps by the great cinematic epics of the period. He commissioned 7 Hollywood composers to write one piece each that together would form the Genesis suite. Both Schoenberg and Stravinsky were asked, and each agreed, as long as their fees were equal. Schoenberg wrote a prelude, and Stravinsky the final movement, Babel. On the night of November 18, 1945, they both attended the premiere at the Wilshire Ebel Theater in Los Angeles, but they pointedly avoided meeting each other. Their paths would not cross again in life, but their musical developments would. In 1945, with the war in Europe winding down, Stravinsky may have thought that he could return to his former glory as the crowned king of the purely musical. But another storm began to brew in Europe, a storm that would have perhaps farther-reaching consequences for Stravinsky than the World War itself. Back in 1913, there had been a riot in the Théâtre Champs-Élysées at the premiere of the Século. Now, a new reaction was coming, and it would not be the music's novelty, but its outmoded neoclassicism that would cause it. At a concert shortly after the liberation of Paris, Stravinsky's 4 Norwegian moods were first performed. Among the audience was a group of young students of the composer Olivier Messiaen. These students made a scene when Stravinsky's new work was performed, whistling and booing, catcalling and jeering. One of these students was 20-year-old Pierre Boulez. Back in Hollywood, Stravinsky heard about all of this and was perplexed. "Why my Norwegian moods?" he asked. But he did not understand, and he did not take note. With the end of the war, many of Stravinsky's refugee friends started returning to Europe, but Stravinsky chose to remain in Hollywood. In fact, on the 28th of December 1945, he and Vera took the oath as U.S. citizens, sponsored by the actor Edward G. Robinson. Stravinsky was enjoying Southern California's open-shirt lifestyle, and Vera now opened a small gallery close by their home, where she would exhibit various modern artists, as well as her own work. They went to the movies, read to each other, they visited the zoo, and started taking trips out to the desert, a place for which Stravinsky felt a special kind of kinship. But Stravinsky's own compositions in this period fell to something of a low point. The scores he had recycled from his movie work were soft-centered and hardly likely to keep him at the forefront of the musical world. He was even commissioned to write a polka for circus elephants. And if Stravinsky was still thinking of furthering his movie career, he nevertheless took a bold step to undermine it. In an article published in 1946, he wrote, "There is only one real function of film music, namely, to feed the composer. In all frankness, I find it impossible to talk to film people about music because we have no common meeting ground. They use music like perfumes which evoke remembrances. As for myself, I need music for hygienic purposes, for the health of my soul. Without music in its best sense, there is chaos. Music is a force which gives reason to things, a force which creates organization, which attunes things." Perhaps Stravinsky wanted to draw a line under his failure and reset his direction using his own compass. But he would have to undergo a total rebirth of style to do so.